The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand. We're gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise to get what we want. We got to organize.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Pantsula podcast. We are the Kaji Circle of the A-APRP, the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Our objective is a liberated and unified Africa under scientific socialism. Thank you once again for joining. My name is Windred, and we're going to start this episode off discussing our ancestors, people who we honor for the work they've done. Our first ancestor is Chief Mahafiry, one of the initiators of the 1904 Madagascar Revolt. Mahafiry started this uprising with his sons Imoza and Fandrana. This uprising spread throughout various regions in Madagascar in response to French colonialism of the land. Here, French officers abused and executed people, stole land, monopolized various aspects of the economy, imposed forced labor, and much more. While the uprising did not succeed in liberation, its progress was advanced by the determination and courage of the rebels, and challenged the French philosophy that Madagascar was willingly open to French colonialization. This led to improved material conditions, and even the French Governor General Augagneur had to admit that, quote, at the base of all colonization is an end, namely profit. But this profit must not be obtained to the complete detriment of any one group. The colonizing race and the colonized race must both draw benefits from it. Our next ancestor is Wangary Maathai. Born as Wangai Muta in Kenya in 1940, she founded the Greenbelt movement with the National Council of Women of Kenya, an organization that challenged deforestation in Kenya and fought for women's rights. When she began to work with community organizations in 1969, she took time to do research in the issues of her community, and after listening to the stories of hundreds of rural and urban women who suffered from malnourishment and poverty, she learned about how issues like deforestation, harmful agricultural practices, and soil degradation furthered a reliance on imported foods lacking the needed vitamins and minerals and led to hunger in rural areas. In 1977, she began the Greenbelt movement to address deforestation, allow people to feed their families with food with proper nutrients, and encourage rural communities, particularly women, to become involved in the politics surrounding Kenya's natural resources and ecosystems. Since its inception in 1977, the Greenbelt movement has planted over 51 million trees and have trained over 30,000 women in forestry, food processing, beekeeping, and other trades that have helped them earn an income while preserving their lands and resources from environmental destruction and private theft of public lands. We thank these two ancestors for the work they've done towards African development and liberation. We'll now move on to the work of another ancestor, Kwame Nkrumah, and his book Consciencism. We've done an analysis on Chapter 1 in an earlier episode, so today we'll discuss Chapter 2. There's a lot discussed in this chapter, and you can see some of Nkrumah's work as a philosophy student embraced. While you don't have to, feel free to follow this analysis with the book itself, and share and comment on any other things you noticed in the chapter. In this chapter, Nkrumah explains that if we want to use philosophy to change society, we need to use the philosophical ideas that are useful to our specific situation. He argues against the notion that philosophical ideas apply to any and every situation, and that these ideas never need to change. Instead, he points out that the very philosophies that people today claim to be universal and eternal, quote unquote, were themselves created to respond to specific times and places. When understanding the societies of the various philosophers, we can see that different philosophies were used to actively change or protect the society that they were a part of. Each philosophy was created for a particular context and primarily used to respond to that specific context. This book was published in 1970 when organizations all across Africa were in the midst of organizing towards independence from colonialism and were now trying to figure out how to structure their new nations. In this context, not only is Nkrumah reiterating the value of having an underlying philosophy, but he is also showing that the structure of these new nations and philosophies should be based upon the underlying material conditions and philosophical goals of the people in these societies. With the Cold War ongoing at the time that this book was published, people were arguing over whether Africa should either continue the colonial structure or copy the structure of a Western or Eastern society or take sides immediately in the Cold War. Even today, we have variations of the same conversation. And so, in this chapter, Nkrumah uses history to argue that the structure and philosophy of these new nations should not be blindly copied from a society that already exists. Instead, the structure should be crafted out of the nation's material conditions and the goals that they had. He focuses his examples towards Western philosophy and highlights how many ideas were created to respond to a philosopher's society at the time. Whether to dismiss the current structure of the society and push for new societal structures, or to justify the ongoing changes at a particular point in time. Each philosophy was created with a practical purpose for a specific situation. This is exemplified on pages 29 and 30, where he says that, quote, when the primary concerns of human life are differentially conceived, philosophy reveals a different bias. And as society becomes differentially organized, philosophy is differently conceived. He begins with ancient Greece. So early in Greek society, when agriculture was the primary concern, their philosophy focused on natural phenomena such as droughts, floods, and disease. Philosophers relied on and were themselves farmers, so these things could severely impact their lives. To explain why these forces of nature came about and offer suggestions on how to navigate their world, they use the idea of a pantheon of gods who controlled the weather and other natural phenomena. As such, nature was made up of not only the physical qualities that we could touch, but also the spiritual aspects that could control it. By doing whatever the gods wished of them to do, one could succeed and be protected in the world. This could include performing particular rituals, acting in fairness and honesty both in private and in public, and sharing resources with others for the future case where you may need resources from them. A lot of this was congregational, as success in an agricultural society required a lot of communal support. All of this was organized by a priesthood, who are seen as the connection of the gods to humanity. They led many of the rituals to ensure a good harvest, and if there wasn't a good harvest, they could explain what the people in the society could do about it. He states on page 33 that, quote, the power of the aristocratic priesthood was based on the belief that those who committed certain crimes infringed the sacred moral order of society, and that they needed to expiate their crimes and be absolved if the whole community was not to be thrown in jeopardy. It was the idea that the whole community was endangered before the gods as a result of certain malpractices of individuals. Unquote. By the time of Thales, however, a new social structure was being formed. As Greece developed its navy, merchants began to trade more across the Mediterranean Sea. They still depended on natural phenomena for things such as traveling the sea, but most of the work they did was traveling, buying, and selling the items instead of working directly in the farm to create products or to create crops. Those who worked with merchants offered services such as protecting and managing their resources, leasing items to process raw materials, and more. For these people, the amount in food and resources they could get depended more so on their individual skills in buying, selling, and trading than their skills in working a farm. Farming required as many people as possible to be involved in the process and was heavily dependent on natural phenomena, so community effort for most farmers were vital. But the work of merchants and their associates utilized individual skills, and they did not necessarily need to share resources with others as much, as they could amass enough resources to get them through bad times. Since they relied on their individual skills and physical tools for their daily lives, nature was less of a concern to merchants and the philosophers in their circles. As long as they had enough resources for emergency situations, they could survive droughts and even several years of a bad harvest. As a result, they will not be thrown in jeopardy by the actions of individuals as much as a farmer would, and their individual needs became much more separate from the needs of the overall community. Here, the rituals that these people cared about became much more individual, and the priests were not needed as much as they once were to explain natural phenomena, as these natural phenomena did not impact these people as much as they had before. It was in this situation that Thales, a philosopher among the merchant class, argued that gods were not the explanation for the universe. By saying that all objects in the universe were made out of water, he dismissed the spiritual aspects of the universe in favor of the physical qualities. In this example, Thales, a man who no longer needed gods and priests for his individual prosperity, and instead relied on the sea for his sustenance, argued that no one needed gods and priests, and that water was vital for our creation and sustenance. He also argued that all people were made out of the same substances and were fundamentally equal. With this came the implication that priests were not inherently better than those who were not. On page 35 and 36, Nkrumah points out that, quote, these philosophies were reflections of social currents, and that they arose from social exigencies. Thus, Thales' philosophy needed, if it was to destroy the allegedly heaven-sanctioned aristocratic society, to assert the irrelevance of a pantheon, and this he did in his attempt to bring all explanation of nature within the ambit of nature itself. Here, we can see that Thales' arguments weren't created out of a vacuum, but created in rejection of the society he existed in. Thales' successor, Anaximander, improved this philosophy by saying that instead of the priests driving social change or stagnation, the principle of justice would do so. And later philosophers continued to make philosophies that attacked the idea that priests should have control over the rules of society. After these philosophies became widely adopted, and merchants and large landowners overthrew the power of the priests in the monarchy, the resultant changes of Greek society brought about the philosophy of Heraclitus. At this point in Greek society, the use of coins instead of land for trading, and the increased trade across the Mediterranean began to increase, and eventually the power of large landowners began to reduce. In attempts to have control over society and therefore its resources, the priests, merchants, and landowners all struggled for power. In the midst of this, Heraclitus argued that this struggle for power was something that we should expect in society. Nkrumah states, quote, this means that society is permanently in revolution, and that revolution is indispensable to social growth and progress. This is now considered dialectics. Anaxagoras continued the idea of equality and expanded it to it by saying that everything was made of seeds. Everything in the world was regulated by reason and the mind. With this philosophy, it was argued that each individual had a part to play in each aspect of the overall society. On page 38, Nkrumah states that, quote, he did not affirm a mere identity of basic makeup. He put forward a theory of the participation of any one kind of object in every other kind of object. In response to this, the Sophists argued for prioritizing the importance of individual humans. This was perverted to the idea that reality was based on what humans decided it was, suggesting that no one was morally bound to follow any rules in society, as nothing was objective and they were all made up. And so the violence of oppressors and people in power were not morally wrong, because there was no morality. In an attempt to bring Greek society towards egalitarianism, Socrates argued that the universe had an objective reality and that all people had innate and equal value. After Socrates' death by the state, Plato argued against the actions of the Greek government by claiming that democracy was flawed. Plato argued that while each person participated in society, there were people who were innately more intelligent, and that only some people could understand objective truths that he described as forms. These forms were not created by humans, but were held in the heavens, above us. Nkrumah suggests that Plato could have believed that a man like Socrates would not have been murdered in such a society for his beliefs. But in spite of Socrates' arguments towards equality, Plato furthers his ideas of inequality by arguing for eugenics. He argued that since people were innately more intelligent than others, or that some people were just naturally more intelligent than others, and this couldn't be something that's caught by or something that's resolved by more education, that those who are the most intelligent should create families and rule over society for all eternity. By the time of the Roman Empire, Christian intellectuals wanted to recreate an aristocratic priesthood where Christians would not be massacred any longer, and argued that there was a distinction between nature and an overlying God. With this one distinction, the Christian intellectuals reaffirmed the ideas of Plato, where those who were the most connected to God were meant to rule over society for all eternity. This was momentarily led by the Pope, as the Christian Church gained control over large swaths of Europe. This church and the large land-owning aristocrats who worked with them, such as Charlemagne, the King of France, began feudalism and the Dark Ages in European society. However, eventually the kings and aristocracy gained more power over the church, when the Pope sought help from Otto I for defense from his threats. When this showed that the Christian church was not all powerful, as they needed another nation's help for defense, they could no longer use Plato's ideas in the same way. Instead, they looked towards Aristotle's philosophy from the First Renaissance, which maintained the inequality that they wanted to maintain, but also argued that the purpose of the state is to bring people of different interests together for an ultimate goal. For a Europe comprised of different warring states, the Church could use this philosophy to argue that while they did not have complete power over the earth, the Church could be used to bring together the different kingdoms of Europe towards a common goal of connection to God and a quote-unquote perfect society. Nkrumah points out that later philosophers such as Hegel continued this idea to justify the actions of the state, in which he said that his government was a political incarnation of the absolute idea of the march of God in history. When rulers such as Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and even Hitler attempted to conquer land and control the resources of their worlds, they too used this idea of aiming towards a perfect society, because it was a justification for the actions that they were doing, to try to justify murder, abuse, and exploitation of other lands. Following the reduction of the power of the Church, philosophers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period, such as John Locke, further challenged the power of the Church by arguing towards humanism, where individual humans were the center point of political organization and knowledge. This humanism branched off into two sects, one which argued by Leibniz that all matter was comprised of self-contained spirits that are invested with the private law of its development, where a pre-established harmony allowed for some spirits to suffer, while other spirits existed in luxury. As Nkrumah notes on page 52, this means that, unquote, this means that every individual has an inalienable right to develop according to his nature, even if his development requires the suffering and subordination of others either in a political or in an economic sense, unquote, and contributes to the philosophy of a democratic capitalism. The other sect, promoted by Descartes, argued that each human has the same innate reason, and that we all have the equal ability to perceive and appreciate the same objective truths about the universe. And in cases where we do not understand something, we need to cooperate with others in order to support the stability of society. Here, uh, even though we do have differences in knowledge at certain stages in our lives, all of us have the equal and same ability to learn more, to understand society more, and to process our understanding and know essential truths about the world, quote unquote, uh, at the same level. And so, if we don't understand something ourselves, we can look towards working with other peoples in order to understand things. And just because one person is knowledgeable about one area in life doesn't mean that no one else is able to understand that same thing to the same extent. And so, such tensions in philosophical understandings of how the state should function and how people should be involved in the state led to physical revolutions and warfare, with examples including the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. Nkrumah's description of these philosophies shows that different philosophies were used to justify particular social orders and changes in society at different points of history. The contentions between philosophers and the arguments and philosophies adopted in a nation were not made just for argument's sake, but they were used to either uphold or challenge the state of the society that they were living in. They were also not made out of the blue, but were made in direct reaction to the social movements, material conditions, and goals of the people and societies that promoted them. Nkrumah ends the chapter on page 55, stating that if we want to use existing philosophies or create new philosophies to further the development of society, especially philosophies that are not our own, we must see it in the context of the intellectual history to which it belongs, and we must see it in the context of the milieu in which it was born. Unquote. And so that concludes this analysis of Chapter 2 of Kwame Nkrumah's Consciencism. If you want to hear more from the All African People's Revolutionary Party and our siblings in the struggle, you can subscribe to our channel, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, join the A-APRP and other podcasts and orgs such as Burkina Books, Our Ancestors' Voices, the A-APRP Southwest Chapter, Revolutionary African Woman, Forward Ever Podcast, and the Forward Ever Shop. All the links are in the description, and we hope you have a great day. And as we usually end these things, Forward Ever.